What does it truly mean to be equal? And how should society distribute its resources? In this deep dive for CSS Breakdown, book by book, Season 05, Episode 10, we crack open Andrew Heywood's political theory, an introduction to tackle these fundamental and often contentious questions. Our mission here is really to pull out the core insights from Heywood's text on equality, social justice, and welfare, helping you understand the nuanced and, often conflicting ideas that shape modern political thought.
It really is fascinating, how much political thinking has shifted. The classical thinkers, they just took hierarchy for granted, right? But modern political philosophy, it mostly starts from this assumption that humans are, in some basic way, equal. But even though almost everyone accepts equality in some form, the principle itself, still incredibly debated. The real argument now isn't if we should have equality, but like Heywood says, it's where, how, and to what equality should be applied.
Okay, so when these theorists talk equality, they're definitely not saying everyone should be like identical clones. That's not the goal. Heywood's quite clear. Equality isn't anti-diversity. It's more about leveling certain key conditions, things we need for well-being, making it possible for everyone to live, equally worthwhile lives.
Exactly. And the earliest version of this idea to really take hold in the West is what we call formal equality, sometimes called foundational or legal equality. This really burst out of the natural rights theories, 17th, 18th centuries. Think of those big declarations, like the American Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. Now, they weren't saying everyone was identical, but making a moral claim. Every human life has equal worth. So everyone's equally human, and the rules of society should treat them that way.
And the clearest example of that is probably equality before the law. The idea that justice should be blind, right? The law is supposed to ignore your background, religion, race, gender, treat you as an individual. And this is pretty much universally approved because it was aimed squarely at getting rid of those old feudal privileges like aristocracy based on birth. It's sort of a negative thing, removing barriers.
But that's also where you hit its limits. You know that famous line from Anatole France? The majestic equality of the law which forbids rich and poor alike to steal bread and to sleep under bridges. Just saying discrimination is illegal doesn't suddenly erase deep-seated racism or economic hardship. Marx, for instance, he basically called legal equality a kind of facade hiding exploitation. And feminists like Mary Wollstonecraft early on argued for equal rights, but later movements realized, well, you need to tackle the deeper social stuff, the patriarchy, that legal rights alone just don't fix. So formal equality is crucial, foundational even, but it often hides these bigger inequalities. Makes you ask, okay, what else do we need?
Right. So if just having the same basic legal rights isn't enough to really level the playing field, where do we look next? Is it about making sure everyone starts in the same place?
Precisely. That brings us straight to equality of opportunity. The focus here shifts to the starting point of life. People talk about an equal start or a level playing field. The core idea, and you can find hints way back with Plato, is that where you end up in society should just be down to your own ability and how hard you work. And pretty much every modern ideology endorses this in some way.
And the people who back this, they aren't expecting everyone to cross the finish line together. Actually, they think the equal start is what justifies people ending up in different places. If everyone starts fair, then the differences later on are seen as down to, well, natural ability. This is the whole basis for a meritocratic society, where your success or failure is supposedly just a reflection of your talent and effort, your personal achievement.
Yeah, but that's where it gets really complicated, because it depends on us being able to cleanly separate natural ability from social advantages. And can we really do that? Heywood points out, look at IQ tests, often presented as pure intelligence measures, but they're massively influenced by social background, culture, and selective schools, even if they aim for merit, often end up favoring kids from middle-class homes. So this idea of natural inequality or pure meritocracy, it's actually pretty shaky. And if you really, really pushed for perfect equality of opportunity, the implications could be quite radical. You might end up seeing the family itself with inheritance, different levels of parental support, as a barrier to that equal start. So you run into this potential clash, this trade-off between equality and freedom. How much intervention is okay?
And that fuels some really heated policy debates, doesn't it? Like positive discrimination, or affirmative action, as it's often called. The idea is to compensate groups for past disadvantages, given a leg up to ensure fair competition, maybe like a handicap in golf. But wow, does it cause arguments. Critics say, hang on, you're trying to achieve fairness by treating people unequally based on group identity. Isn't that violating equal rights? It's a real knotty problem balancing historical wrongs with individual merit now.
Okay, so if equal opportunity also has its problems and limitations, that leads us to the most, let's say, radical form, equality of outcome. Here, the focus shifts completely from the starting line to the finish line. The ideal is kind of all runners finish the race in line together.
Mm.
And this is a major ideological dividing line. Socialists, communists, some anarchists, they generally push for a high degree of social equality, whereas conservatives, and many liberals too, tend to see that as either wrong or just plain unnatural.
So the arguments for equality of outcome, often it's that other kinds of equality are basically meaningless without it. Like, what good are voting rights if you're homeless or can't find work? Proponents often argue that the differences we see between people, they're mostly down to how society treats them unequally, not some inherent difference in talent.
Exactly. And they see it as essential for real individual liberty. Rousseau, for example, he worried that big gaps in wealth would basically make slaves of the poor and corrupt the rich. It's also argued it's crucial for, social peace, stability, creating a common culture. R.H. Tawney had that great phrase criticizing equal opportunity as the tadpole philosophy. Only a few lucky tadpoles make it out of the pond. Equality of outcome, in this view, is about fostering a shared interest by collectivizing wealth to some degree.
But then you get the really strong criticisms against it, that it leads to stagnation, it's unjust, maybe even leads to tyranny. If you remove the incentives for people to work hard, to innovate,
Yeah.
does everything just level down? Does it crush personal drive?
Critics like Friedrich Hayek, he thought the whole push for social equality was driven by social envy, and that achieving it requires massive interference. Basically, social engineering. People sometimes point to extreme examples, like China's Cultural Revolution with its attacks on any kind of perceived privilege, as a warning of where it could lead. So the fear is you sacrifice freedom and dynamism for a kind of forced uniformity.
Okay, that makes sense. So from equality, we move into another really charged area, social justice.
Yeah.
You mentioned Hayek called it a weasel word. Why so contentious? It sounds good, right? A morally defensible distribution of benefits or rewards in society. Basically asking who should get what. But clearly, people disagree wildly on the answer.
Oh, massively. There's no single definition everyone agrees on. David Miller actually identified three main competing principles, which is helpful. He talked about justice based on needs, justice based on rights, and justice based on deserts.
Let's take the first one. Justice according to needs. That sounds quite socialist. Marx's famous line, right? From each according to his ability to each according to his needs.
Exactly. And the key here is that needs are seen as different from just wants or preferences. Needs are necessities, things you have to have satisfied. They're often framed as objective, universal. Think Maslow's hierarchy, food, water, shelter, safety, healthcare. So if needs are universal, the implication is that resources should be distributed to meet everyone's basic needs, often through public services. But, of course, needs aren't always equal. Someone who's sick clearly needs more healthcare resources than someone who's healthy. So it's not about identical shares, but about meeting necessary requirements.
But the critics jump in here, don't they? Saying needs are actually really hard to define. They're kind of abstract. They change over time between cultures. And conservatives or classical liberals would argue, well, resources should follow preferences shown in the market, not some top-down definition of need. And they often question this whole idea that we have a fundamental social responsibility for each other's basic needs.
Yeah, it's a deep philosophical divide. But amidst all this, John Rawls came up with his hugely influential theory of justice as fairness. It's probably one of the most important contributions in recent times. It wasn't strictly talking needs, but used the idea of primary goods, things anyone would rationally want, like rights, liberties, opportunities, income, wealth. And he proposed two main principles. First, everyone gets the maximum basic liberty compatible with liberty for others. Second, social and economic inequalities are okay only if they benefit the least advantaged members of society, and if the positions they're attached to are open to everyone under conditions of fair equality of opportunity. The really clever part was his justification. Imagine you're behind a veil of ignorance. You don't know your race, class, talents. Rawls argued rational self-interest would lead you to choose these principles because you'd want to protect yourself if you ended up at the bottom.
Okay, that's Rawls. Now, what about the second principle Miller mentioned? Justice according to rights. This sounds like a pushback against the more egalitarian ideas. You mentioned Robert Nozick.
Exactly. This is often associated with libertarian thought. Rights here aren't universal entitlements in the same way. They're things you earn or acquire, usually through your own effort, talent, or maybe inheritance. Think classical liberal ideas about property rights coming from your own labor. Nozick's big idea was procedural justice. He wasn't concerned with the pattern of distribution, who has how much, but only with how people got what they have. He proposed 3 rules. Was the wealth originally acquired justly? Was it transferred justly, like through voluntary exchange or gifts? And has any past injustice in acquisition or transfer been rectified? If those processes are fair, then whatever distribution results, even massive inequality, is just. So, for Nozick, redistributing wealth through taxes to help the poor isn't a moral requirement, that's just theft from those who earned it. Charity is fine, but it has to be voluntary.
But that approach gets hit with some serious objections too, right? Like, it completely ignores the end result. Someone could be starving, but if the wealth distribution came about justly, according to Nozick's rules, then, well, too bad. And how do you even establish the original just acquisition of natural resources? Who got the right to own land or oil first, and why? Plus, critics say it's based on this hyper-individualistic view, possessive individualism, that just ignores how much society contributes to anyone's ability to create wealth. It sort of encourages selfishness.
Yeah, those are the main lines of attack. Which brings us to Miller's third principle, justice according to deserts. What you deserve based on your worth or contribution. This often connects with conservative ideas, sometimes even religious ones, like Edmund Burke seeing the existing social order, including the market, as reflecting some kind of natural justice, maybe even God's will, something you just don't tamper with.
And Herbert Spencer, with his survival of the fittest, applied to society. Individuals get the rewards and punishments of their own nature and actions. Thomas Malthus, too, arguing that trying to eliminate poverty was futile because things like famine and disease were just nature's way of checking population growth. Grim stuff.
Very grim. And the criticism is that this isn't really a moral theory of justice at all. It's more like saying what is right, or at least inevitable. It avoids making moral judgments about fairness. It also seems to ignore that modern societies can actually intervene to prevent things like mass starvation or provide health care. So critics see it as a potential justification for simply ignoring suffering, labeling it natural when it might be preventable.
Okay, so we've navigated equality and these different, often conflicting ideas of social justice. Let's shift gears slightly to welfare. This feels like where the rubber meets the road, the practical application of these ideals. And the debate around the welfare state has been huge, especially since the early 20th century.
Absolutely. Welfare in general just means well-being or happiness, but the political debate is about collectively provided welfare, the welfare state. And it connects directly back. It's linked to equality because it aims to ensure a basic minimum standard of living for everyone. And it's linked to social justice, especially that needs-based idea we discussed. Now, welfare state can mean slightly different things. Broadly, just a state where providing welfare is a major function. More narrowly, the specific institutions, Social Security, National Health Services, public education, unemployment benefits, and so on. And different countries do it differently, right? You have safety net models like the U.S. historically, pay-as-you-go insurance models like Germany, and more universal benefit systems like Sweden or the original UK beverage model.
And at the heart of all welfare systems is the issue of poverty. We should probably distinguish between absolute poverty, lacking the basic necessities to physically survive, like food and shelter, and relative poverty. Relative poverty is about being poor compared to the general standard of living in your society. It links poverty directly to inequality. You might have food and shelter, but still be excluded from what's considered a normal life.
That ties into a more recent concept, too, social exclusion. This is broader than just income poverty. It looks at multiple forms of deprivation, lacking education, job opportunities, cultural participation, political voice. Thinking in terms of social exclusion shifts the focus. It's less about just handing out money, redistribution, and more about boosting people's ability to participate fully in society. Equality gets redefined as social inclusion.
Now, for a long time, especially after World War II, there was broad support for the welfare consensus. What were the main arguments for it back then? One early driver was actually national efficiency, the idea that you need a healthy, educated population for a strong economy and, frankly, an effective army. You saw this push even before World War I.
Definitely. And another big one was social cohesion, preventing unrest. Figures like Disraeli in Britain with his one nation idea, or Bismarck in Germany, worried that huge inequalities would tear society apart. So they introduced early welfare measures, partly to stop people turning to socialism. It often had a paternalistic flavor, the duty of the elites, noblesse oblige, to look after the less fortunate.
Then there was the liberal argument, particularly from the new liberals around the turn of the 20th century. For them, welfare wasn't about undermining individualism, but enhancing it. By protecting people from risks like unemployment, sickness, poverty, the five giants Beveridge talked about, you actually gave them more freedom, enabled them to help themselves, to participate fully.
And the socialist or social democratic case went furthest. They saw welfare as promoting communitarianism, building social solidarity. Richard Titmuss wrote about the gift relationship, how universal services foster a sense of shared obligation. Fundamentally, they viewed welfare as a tool for redistribution, a way to tame capitalism, reduce inequality, and move closer to equality of outcome, usually funded by progressive taxes where the rich pay a higher percentage.
But that post-war consensus eventually fractured, didn't it? Leading to the big debate we still have today. Welfare, rollback or reform? What happened?
While the economic shocks of the 1970s oil crises, inflation, slowing growth put huge pressure on government budgets, the cost of welfare states seemed unsustainable to many, leading to a backlash. The new right mounted a powerful critique, hitting welfare on both moral and economic grounds. Morally, they argued it creates dependency, it traps people in poverty, it discourages work. You heard terms like welfare junkies, arguments from people like Charles Murray about an underclass losing the work ethic because of benefits. So they advocated for welfare just being a minimal safety net, tightly targeted, maybe linked to work requirements. Workfare welfare had to be earned. Economically, the argument was that high taxes needed to fund welfare-stifled enterprise, while generous benefits discouraged people from taking low-paid jobs. This led to calls for privatization, market mechanisms in welfare delivery, and the trickle-down idea. Cut taxes and welfare, boost the economy, and eventually everyone benefits.
Okay, so that's the rollback argument. What about the welfare reform perspective? This is more associated with, say, New Labour in the UK or third-way thinking. They don't necessarily want to dismantle the welfare state, but they agree it needs changing. They tend to argue the issue isn't just lack of money, but lack of opportunities, skills, cultural resources for people to get ahead. So the focus shifts from just giving out benefits, curative welfare, to trying to prevent dependency in the first place, preventative policies. Things like welfare to work programs, big investment in education and training, trying to boost employability. It's about social inclusion, but through work and opportunity.
Exactly. It's trying to find that middle ground between the old model and the pure market approach, still aiming for security and opportunity, but with a much stronger emphasis on individual responsibility and the importance of work.
Wow. We certainly covered a lot of ground. From the basic idea of equality through different theories of justice, right up to the ongoing debates about the welfare state. It's crystal clear these concepts, equality, social justice, welfare, aren't simple things with neat answers.
Yeah.
They're deeply, deeply contested principles that really define the kind of society we live in or want to live in.
Absolutely. The tensions just keep reappearing, don't they? Equal starts versus equal finishes, individual responsibility versus our obligations to each other. How do we define what's truly just when it comes to who gets what? It's an ongoing conversation, and these ideas from Heywood really lay out the landscape of that debate.
So maybe a final thought for you, the listener, to mull over. As you think about all this, how should societies navigate that really tricky balance between encouraging individual drive and making sure everyone has a basic level of security and well-being? Where do you think that balance lies?